Hi, how are you?
Hi, Tamara. I'm Safear. How you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you for taking the invitation. I appreciate it. So basically, the other day, we did an interview with a few currently incarcerated abolitionists talking about gun violence. We're all from PA. Two of us were from Philly, one was from Pittsburgh, and we were just talking about gun violence. We were talking about this narrative from the right about, how this increase in gun violence is due to efforts to defund the police and what people thought about that. We were talking about why is gun violence increasing, in their opinion. What can be done to intervene in this increase in gun violence, and we were talking about, just some things. Why is it important for people in prison to engage in these types of conversations and various things like that. So we got that recorded, and Garrett, and I was talking to Garrett about this, and he had told me about a webinar that he's seen from you recently. On crime data and things like that. So I got a little bit familiar with your work, but being in prison and being that it's very hard to get information.
Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution, Fayette.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring.
I'm not as well versed as I would like to be, but I'm hoping that, in this interview, you can just kind of, I guess, just walk us through, who you are and what you do and how this relates to the current increase in gun violence and the narratives we're hearing about it. I guess in essence, so is that something that you'd be okay to engage with?
Sure.
Okay. So I guess I'll start it off. Ian, are you recording?
Yes.
Okay. So, what's up, y'all? This is Safear. I'm here with Tamara Knopper. Is that how you say your name? Phil? I'm sorry.
Yep.
Okay, Tamara Knopper. And maybe they can explain to you a little bit about who they are and what they do. Could you? Excuse me. I'm sorry. Would you mind telling us who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Tamara, and I want to thank you, Safear and Ian, for inviting me on the show. I am a sociologist by training, so I do research, and I also write and publish, but I also teach a lot, and I teach a lot in classes that deal with the criminal punishment system. And in sociology, I just think a lot about data. So I've done a lot of work around crime data collection and just kind of analyzing how it gets used in these conversations and in kind of different political agendas.
Okay, cool. Very cool.
And also, Safear, I just have to say, I lived in Philadelphia for like 15 years, so
okay.
Yeah, so...
Yeah, definitely. We can relate there, then. I'm from Philly, So, we often hear about crime, right? We hear it in various aspects. We hear it in the media.
This is a call from
Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution, Fayette.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring.
The word crime is constantly appearing in our media and our dialogues with each other. And I think for most people, like the average person, they just think of crime as something that is against the law, usually something, morally incorrect, and that the people who commit crime are bad people, right? This is like a narrative that has gone around for a long time. So could you tell us, what is crime? How do you define crime?
Oh my goodness, that's a huge question. So thank you for asking it. But one of the things, as I had said, is I'm a teacher, and we actually start some of my criminal justice classes or criminal punishment classes about this, is how has crime actually been kind of defined? And if you look at criminology, which is the kind of quote unquote scientific study of crime and punishment, there's these debates about that. Is it measured by what is, technically against the law in terms of a law that's on the books, or is it, measured by harm and violence, which could be technically against the law but isn't, right? Or it could or couldn't be. But it's also it's sometimes analyzed by scholars as like what are considered quote unquote disorders or deviant behavior. And so part of what we're trying to do in some of my classes is think about like, how does crime get actually measured, but also how does it get imagined, right? And a lot about crime data and these kind of discussions about crime going up or down is precisely about this. Like, when do we think something is a crime? And are all harms and violence that do occur, because usually when people are thinking about crime, they're encouraged to kind of think about it as often violence, right? And to think that that's what people are talking about. But all violence and harm are not legally considered crimes. And then all things that are legally considered crimes are not actually violent, quote unquote, offenses. And, we can also raise questions about how harmful are some of the things that are legally considered crimes, right? And so that's some of the kind of questions. And, when you and I get more into some of the stuff about crime data, we can talk about like some of the data sources that people often cite in these conversations. That's still a question that, need to kind of address, because it's also about like, how do you actually measure crime? And if you're making these claims about crime data, well, is what you're talking about as kind of your data source or your kind of data point, is that actually a crime, right? So, you know what I mean? But I would say that it's important for people to distinguish between harm and violence that can be real and that can happen, that does happen in some cases, from what we think of as legally as crime, and understanding where they collide, obviously, because sometimes, people are dealing with real cases of being charged with crimes or convicted of crimes, and that has real effects on kind of how they have to exist in the world, and how they get marked in the world. But there's ways where I think when we're having these political debates, distinguishing between like a harm or violence versus what is legally a crime, I think is actually politically important to do.
Okay. So we have to make a distinction between harm and crime. Those things are not always the same, but they can be the same.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I'll give you some examples. It's like, if we think about vagrancy, right? That can be an offense legally. But vagrancy can often be, something like you're just have nowhere to go, literally.
Right.
Or you don't have a place, to kind of be able to be privately kind of tucked into, right? And so, but that's something that could be technically considered against the law. If we think about the way that people can commit harm, like, a company can commit something like wage theft or something. Like, it's technically considered against law, but it's not really prosecuted, right? And so there's ways where it's like things that are harmful can be done legally. So I'll give you an example. If we think about, and this kind of, I know one of the questions that you wanted to explore is about white-collar crime, right?
Yeah.
So is it okay if I talk a little bit about white-collar crime here to kind of illustrate the point?
Okay. Whatever you want.
Okay, thank you. So this is white-collar crime. This is an example of like something that is more of an analytical construction of crime, and it's not really kind of on the books in the same way. So white-collar crime is more of like a political critique. It started as, there's a concept called white-collar criminality, and it was a sociologist who coined this concept, and Edwin Sutherland, and he was the president of the American Sociological Association. He gives this kind of presidential address. And it was meant to be a critique of how crime was actually studied. And he said a lot of the social science research focuses on crime committed by poor and working class people. So things that might be associated with like theft or like street crimes, as some people might call them. And he said, but crimes committed by business people don't get as much attention, even though business people can commit a lot of serious harm to society through kind of different forms of fraud or business theft and so forth. And so he coined this concept of white-collar criminality. Today we hear the term kind of white-collar crime, used to critique people who are wealthy or who we see as privileged or who have like institutional power, and they might do certain kind of, business crimes around like insider trading or so forth, right? But the FBI said they have a website where they kind of talk about they talk about the concept of white collar crime on its website, and they cite actually Edwin Sutherland, the sociologist. But if you look at what you get charged with, so they say, oh, these are white collar crimes, and then they list different things that you can get charged with that they conceptualize as white collar crime, and things like insider trading, things like money laundering, and things like trying to tamper with voter registration processes, right? So, but the thing is, when you get arrested, you're not arrested for it doesn't say white collar crime. Do you know what I mean? It's an analytical category, right? But this is an example where harm could be legal. So if we think about Martin Shkreli, who's known as kind of Pharma Bro, right? He got convicted of what would be conceptually considered white collar crime for, some, stuff around insider trading, stuff like that, right? In terms of fraud and so forth. So he gets convicted for that. But he was able to legally jack up the prices of HIV medication, right? To make them so enormously expensive. And in doing so, makes it much more difficult for people to afford HIV medication, which really, plays a big impact on premature death, right? But he can legally do that. Do you see what I'm saying? And so there's stuff where it's so I use that example.
You have 1 minute left.
I use that example in my classes to talk about this stuff.
I'm just going to cut you off for a second. I'm going to have to wind up calling you right back in because we only got 15 minutes left. So I'm going to call right back, and then hopefully we can pick it up. Okay?
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much.
The caller has hung up.
All right, I think we're all back.
All right. Sorry about that. That's a hassle of prison.
So, Safear, I have a question. How do you define crime?
That's a good question. What did you say? That's a big question. So I believe that crime is a social construct, right? It's not something that is necessarily harmful. It's not something that is necessarily, quote-unquote, immoral, right? But crime is something that is made in society sometimes to prevent harm, right? That's the key crime, and laws against these crimes at times. But I also think that often crime is constructed in a way which subjugates and disenfranchises and oppresses, marginalized communities. So, even one of the things that you mentioned was about vagrancy. And I specifically remember Simone Brown mentioning how there was a time when both vagrancy and loitering were made illegal, specifically targeting black people. Right? And she was saying that, in essence, what this did was made it illegal for black people to both stand around and move. Right? So, crime a lot of times is just a way to enter marginalized communities into the prison system. So when I think of crime, and even when I think of how it's collected, which I'm hoping that you can go in way more than I can, I think of it often as a weapon that those in power use to justify their own existence. I think of it in a way where people create certain things as crimes, targeting certain groups, and then once those groups are incarcerated as a result of it, and we see people being locked up for those crimes, that data is then used to justify those same oppressive laws. See, we locked up these people because they were committing these crimes. This is why we need to have more law enforcement. This is why we need to have more laws against these crimes. So, I look at it in a way where it's often weaponized. That's how I look at it. But maybe you can help inform us about how crime data is collected. Maybe there's a certain science to it that I don't understand. Maybe you can help us out.
Sure. So I'll talk about a couple of the major crime data sets that get kind of cited and so forth. So, like, there are two data sets that are considered kind of national data sets, but that's actually a misnomer for one of them. So the one data set is the Uniform Crime Report. And that's the data set that, like, maybe about, like in the summer, you saw all of this kind of punditry and people writing these, like, think pieces and doing these tweets talking about how...
Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution, Fayette.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring.
And they were talking about how, crime has gone up and violent crime is up in the past year, and they were using it to discredit defund campaigns or abolitionist campaigns. And so the data that a lot of them were citing was coming from the Uniform Crime Report, and the Uniform Crime Report had just put out kind of some recent data to kind of that was getting circulated. And the Uniform Crime Report, part of its origins actually comes from the police. It was the International Association of the Chiefs of Police in the progressive era during the 30s. And what was happening was the police were getting critiqued by politicians and in the press for not, quote unquote, doing their job. And one of the things that, of course, we can think about, especially in relationship to what you said about, the social construction of crime, is that, what is the police doing their job? What does that mean? And what do we think their, quote unquote, job is? Both kind of the literal job, but what do we think their function is in society as well? And so there is this idea that they, quote unquote, weren't doing their job. And the assumption was that their job was to keep the public safe. Obviously, abolitionists raise critical questions around, do the police actually keep people safe, or do they actually kind of increase the lack of safety for a lot of communities in terms of being vulnerable to violence or being vulnerable to kind of the way police use themselves as a force to help politically repress social justice movements, right? Okay. But what happens is the International Association of Chiefs of Police say, okay, well, we're getting all these criticisms about how we should do better policing, but we need more data. And so they actually push for kind of more data collection. And one of the things that I keep, emphasizing when I talk about crime data in different venues is...
Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution, Fayette.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring.
Is that part of the history of crime data collection in the United States is both kind of pro-police propaganda. It was a way for police to kind of rehabilitate their public image in the face of these critiques about not, quote unquote, doing their job. But crime data collection has also been a way to try to justify the presence of policing, to say, well, look at all this data and look at all these issues, so, quote unquote, you need us, right? And it's also been used as kind of a police management tool, meaning the International Association of Chiefs of Police said, well, if you want us to do policing, quote unquote, better, and you want us to kind of be a better workforce in that way, well, we need data. And so it was part of that kind of zeitgeist of scientific management and using kind of data and collecting data on labor patterns and stuff to better manage a workforce. And so this is the origins of the Uniform Crime Report. So today, people often refer to the Uniform Crime Report. I think I've done that publicly. I think I did my webinar that you mentioned, saying it's a national crime data set. But I thought more about it, and I was like, it's actually not a national data set, because the way the Uniform Crime Report data is collected is it's collected voluntarily. So meaning police forces have to volunteer the data. They're not obligated. And that's actually a big kind of battle over kind of data collection dealing with law enforcement, right? But also different law enforcement agencies, especially locally, have different measurements of crime. So I'll give you an example, and I've shared this publicly before, but I had a colleague that I knew, we were both adjunct professors at the same institution, and they were brutally murdered by, well, murders are brutal, so they were murdered by someone they knew. And the man came to his house and slit him in the throat and left him to die. And there were these allegations of sexual violence being involved in terms of like, the allegation was that the man came back to kind of deal with having been sexually assaulted. So I don't know if sexual assault happened, right? But there was these allegations of sexual assault being part of the situation. And it was from reading about this man's case, and this man that I knew who died, he lived in another state at that time than when we had known each other. And it was reading about his case that I learned that in that state he lived in, the state technically did not count rape as legally rape if it was between people of the same sex. So it was this homophobic measurement, right, of who could be, quote unquote, legally raped, right? And this is something I bring up to my students too, is that like when we think about what is measured as a crime on the books as against the law, there's a lot of politics about kind of what is considered legally a violation and what is actually a violation, right? Because we do know that people of the same sex can be raped and can also rape each other. But, and so one of the things that happens is reason why it's called Uniform Crime Report is the FBI, they have to deal with, okay, we want to have data. The FBI wants to have data about kind of crime patterns all across the country. That's the national part of it. But if you have law enforcement that has different, first of all, kind of legal definitions of certain acts and determining if it's a crime or not legally, but also the way they input the data could be different, right? And so people also have to remember that crime data is both kind of what gets measured as quote unquote an offense legally, but it's also how it's input as data and how it gets classified as a data category. And so the reason why it's called Uniform Crime Report is that the FBI has this kind of coding system that people have to kind of use to input local law enforcement data into kind of the categories and into kind of the organization of how the FBI conceptualizes things. So what the FBI did for a long time is they had a hierarchy rule, meaning, let's say if you have one situation that involves multiple forms of violence or harm, or what on the books would be considered multiple crimes, right? So somebody might be assaulted and robbed, right? What they had a hierarchy rule for a long time that was you had to list the most egregious offense as the offense, right? Which meant that homicide was usually considered the most egregious offense, right? And so homicide gets kind of amplified in the Uniform Crime Report data set. Well, now the Uniform Crime Report is no longer kind of operating with that hierarchy rule. So it's changing the data. So this also raises questions about comparisons between years. And so what happened was in the summer, people were arguing like, oh, look at, the data, the crime is up, the crime is down. So it's always about, is the violent crime up or down, right? That's how the debate gets framed a lot of times. And that was used, right? But what happens is, comparisons can also be difficult in data sets because one is, if it's voluntary, not all cities report their data. And so if you actually looked at the data set that people were citing in the summer, that data set did not include Philadelphia, it didn't include Chicago, and it didn't include New York, right? And it was a very much smaller response rate. And so this is something, too, that when we think about kind of like how crime data circulates, it usually circulates in this kind of sensationalist, is crime up or down? And abolitionists participate in this conversation, too. They'll be like, well, the crime is down, right? So abolitionists will be really quick to try to like kind of prove the crime is down, while like anti-abolitionists will try to prove the crime is up. But they're both kind of working with the logic of these data sets. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, because one, the police are not mandated to enter data, right? So we can never get a completely uniform set, right? Two, not only are they not mandated to, right, but the way that they have to input the data can bias, it seems like, the results, right, based upon what's considered the most, aggregate crime that was put in at that time. And it makes me think, though, like there's this real concept out there that data is unbiased, right? Like as long as we have the data, then we'll know how to move forward. But it seems like you're saying here that it's really, we have to really look at how this data is being collected.
Yeah, so if we look at, for example, so if we go to kind of when is a crime, right? So a lot of the data, and this is something I've talked about with like some of the local law enforcement data. So for example, I did a presentation recently specifically on New York City crime data and their use of CompStat. So New York City, they're quote unquote, they're very big on kind of quote unquote data transparency. So you actually can find quite a lot of data regarding policing and law enforcement on its website.
You have 1 minute left.
You can just talk for the 1 minute and I'll call back one more time.
Okay, great. And so, but there's all these ways that like you could say, oh, they're really open with their data. But if you look at how they talk about crime on their website, it's people reporting a violation, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is a question. When does a crime become a crime? Is it when somebody reported something, right? Is it when somebody's arrested for something? Is it when somebody's charged with something? Is it when somebody's convicted of something, right? And so, so some cities measure crime data as like what was reported to the police, right? And that has a whole set of problems. And one of the things, though, I do say is that within this data are some real stories going on, right? Like some people were harmed or victimized, right? And so people
Thank you for using Securus. Goodbye.
Also, I have a question while we're waiting.
Sure.
What got you into data arts, like in the first place?
Just thinking about data.
Yeah.
Part of it was I teach classes in college, and I had students for a long time. I teach in the social sciences, which is a lot of like numbers and data and tables and pie charts and all that. Mm-hmm. And I had a lot of students that, this is like years ago, who couldn't explain to me what was going on in a pretty basic table. Like just what direction do you read the table, and how, what's this percentage referring to, right?
Actually, sorry, he's called now. I'll get back to you in a second. Sorry.
Hello, this is a free call from
an incarcerated individual at SCI Fayette. This call is not private. It will be recorded and may be monitored. If you believe this should be a private call, please hang up and follow facility instructions to register this number as a private number.
To accept this free call, press 1. To refuse this free call, press. Thank you for using Securus. You may start the conversation now.
Hello.
Hey again, flipping you over. Okay, we're all back.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
Oh, no, it's okay. So if you look at the New York City data, right, so part of it is they associate crime, when they like say, oh, this is crime data, it's basically reports, right? So if then someone might say, well, is it a crime if somebody got arrested? But actually, if we think about the debate about, the role of the police, part of the debate has been, do the police, quote unquote, solve crime, right? And abolitionists have, kind of used that as a talking point sometimes. Some abolitionists have to say, well, the police don't actually solve crime. And one of the things, I'm always kind of interested in is how do people think a crime is solved? Like, how does that get measured? And if you look at, a lot of data, like different law enforcement agencies will use different measurements, but the way like it gets measured in different cities a lot of times is the clearance data. Clearance can mean different things, but at its most fundamental, at its most kind of basic, it often means someone just got arrested, right? So some clearance data sources will say, well, someone was arrested, someone was charged, and then turned over to the courts for prosecution. So I asked my class when I showed them this, and we talked about this measurement, and I said, do you think that everybody who has been arrested or charged with a crime, I said, did the crime? And they were like, no. You know what I mean? Like, and so this is an issue. Like, what does it mean that even how we talk about it, if something was solved? So in some cases, we might say, well, somebody did a crime. Okay, when do you decide a crime was done? And that's a big part of like the question about how to even think about this data. But also, how do you think a crime is solved? And if clearance data is just basically someone got arrested, right? And the clearance measurement has often been used to talk about solved crimes. I think that's also an issue. But what else? Sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say, it definitely sounds like a major issue. I just did want to say, I want to ask you, because you mentioned abolitionists quite a few times, and now I'm abolitionists. Ian's an abolitionist. Are you an abolitionist?
I mean, I don't go around kind of announcing myself that way, but I definitely, yeah.
Okay. So you're inclined to an abolitionist viewpoint? All right, can we settle with that?
Yeah, but I also think, part of what I'm interested in with the crime data conversations is I think there's a lot for abolitionists to think about how we use crime data, right? Yeah. And this is something that I've talked about in different ways, because when you see these kind of
Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution, Fayette.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring.
Because when you see these kind of anti-defund or anti-abolitionist kind of agendas, especially when they're using crime data to kind of go after abolitionists, I'm always curious about how abolitionists kind of respond to the crime data debates. And sometimes I think more of abolitionists that we could think more critically about how we kind of use crime data to make our cases. You know what I mean? Right?
Right. Like, should we even be using crime data? Like, should we, knowing how it's collected, right? Should we be settling for the standard that's been given to us? I think about that in your conversation. One of the things for me, being an abolitionist inside of prison, is that me and my comrades, we've noticed that a lot of academic material written on subjects such as prison, such as crime and policing, are not really written for those most affected by those topics, right? Meaning that prisoners are often excluded from those academic conversations. I mean, for one reason, because of the jargon, right? Just because of the language difference. And two, because of communication barriers.
Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution, Fayette.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring.
So a lot of times, when I read academic material or I talk to, people such as yourself, I always have in my mind that I want to translate these conversations for the average person, for the average person, right? I want to create a conversation where, the people can really understand what we're talking about and make it relevant. So I think maybe one of the ways that we can maybe make it more relevant, because it's definitely, all the stuff you're talking about is extremely important for us to understand because of how heavily it's used. And it's being used right now, right? Like, that's not like a made-up thing. Like, right now, people are citing this increase in homicides, while other crimes, the data suggests, are decreasing, right? But they're using this as a narrative to say, see, this is why we can't defund the police. This is why we have to go back to law and order. And how do you see right now in the media the use of these crime data sets, and do you think they're being used correctly and as correct justification for these things?
Well, before I answer that, thank you for asking that, and also thank you for sharing your analysis about some of the abolitionist literature, especially written by academics that you've read and engaged. So before I answer that, I was going to ask you, like, what had been for you and others on the inside, what have been some of the conversations about crime data or about kind of quote unquote rising crime kind of headlines that have been happening?
So it's interesting that you say that, because I think for most of us in here, we're so conditioned to this thought that, again, data is unbiased, that, we've been referring back to it. But look, crime data is, down over here and it's up over here. And our conversation honestly has me questioning, I've always knew and understood, or not always, but I've known and understood for a while that crime is a social construct. Like how you were saying before, how we have to separate harm from crime. Those are not always the same things, right? And, what the implications of that are. But now, like from our conversation, I'm coming to even understand that, maybe our reliance on this data as a whole is misplaced. Is it accurate, right? Should we be even relying on this data? That's where you got me thinking now. Forget what I was thinking about before.
Well, and so I'm going to add another layer here to kind of have us think through together, because this is something I've been struggling with, and I've seen this other data set. So I talked about UCR data, and that's the one that tends to get kind of cited most in some of these debates. And then some, like, people who are focusing on New York, and New York gets so much attention in these conversations, they focus on, like, New York City CompStat data. But there's another data set, and have you ever heard of the National Crime Victimization Survey?
No, not familiar with that.
So this is actually a national data set, meaning that, like, unlike the Uniform Crime Report, which is like local data sources that just get kind of input in a uniform, quote unquote, coding system, like the National Crime Victimization Survey is carried out by the census, and it's and then they partner with the Bureau of Justice Statistics to make the data available. And the reason why, some people will say, well, we shouldn't use the UCR data because the UCR data is collected by the police, and it's not, and because of their political biases and so forth. But what some abolitionists will say is they'll kind of then look to the National Crime Victimization Survey, because National Crime Victimization Survey is basically conducted by the census, so they're not the police, and they're also asking about, like, when have you been victimized, right? And so they also ask, like, did you report to the police? Why not? So some people have looked at that data to say, well, look, a significant number of people have been victimized, but they are not reporting to the police. And then people have, sometimes speculated, why haven't people reported to the police, or they've drawn from kind of some of the data that respondents gave about why they didn't. But one of the things is that, I think we still have to raise questions around National Crime Victimization Survey, because part of why I say we need to figure out a way to kind of measure harm and violence, or like acknowledge harm and violence can exist different from crime, is because crime is a construct that is already encouraging us to think that policing and criminal punishment is the answer. Right, once you define something as a crime. So a harm can actually happen and violence can actually happen. But when it gets classified as a crime, it's already being kind of predisposed for us to want to deal with it through the criminal punishment system, right? Which is different than wanting to address harm or violence in other ways, whether it's through non-carceral mental health services, whether it's through kind of rehabilitative, programs, whether it's through, other forms of kind of repair, or whether it's through being trained on de-escalation and kind of conflict management, right? A whole range of other types of maybe ways of trying to address harm or violence, both in terms of trying to make it less likely that harm and violence will occur, but also trying to kind of deal with like what happens after harm and violence has occurred, right? And so one of the concerns I have about the National Crime Victimization Survey is like everything is considered a crime. So you're being asked to kind of say like, when have you been victimized? And they get very specific in the kind of survey, like, you know, where were you? Were you on your front porch? Were you here? Somebody stole something from you? Would they steal from you, right? And this isn't to say that people, everybody who responds to something, people are responding on what they think happened or what they believe happened, right? So, but one of the things, or what they want us to think happened, right? But one of the things is that survey, it conflates victimization with crime. And so you're always being encouraged when you answer these questions to think every act that happened to you was a crime. And so this is not to say that something might not, but I know people who've been stolen from or who've been, victimized in different ways. And they have tried to work out for themselves what that means emotionally, what that means for them kind of, in terms of how they see the situation. They've worked really hard on putting it in perspective and however they put it in perspective. What the National Crime Victimization Survey does is it says, everything that has happened to you, we want you to think of it as a crime, right? Because you're reporting crime to us. National Crime Victimization Survey, right? And so I've had concerns because some abolitionists will say, well, this is a more authentic survey because it's not from the police. The police aren't collecting this data, even though, again, we have to remember some of the data police are collecting are stuff that people reported to them, right? And put their name on the report, right? But people say, well, the National Crime Victimization Survey, this is like real quote unquote data, or this is the data we should be dealing with because these people didn't report to the police, but they've been victimized. But I'm like, but it's still encouraging us to see all of this as crime. It's still being marketed for that.
The whole framework of it is carceral, really.
That's exactly right. And so just because it's not being collected by the police doesn't mean it's not, the fact that you're expected to kind of think of all these things that happened to you in a year, and that's how this survey is designed, and the ways you were victimized, but you're being expected to kind of, you're always being told in the survey, like, it's being described as crime, and then it's being reported to the public as these are crimes that have happened. And so it's not being said, this is victimization versus harm, and, and we shouldn't be carceral. It's being reported as like unreported crimes. Do you see what I'm saying? But it's still within this discourse of crime.
It seems like you're suggesting that we need a new way to...
You have 1 minute left.
...to collect harm data.
Data. Right, like how do people... Exactly, like, how do people get their harms and violence that has happened to them addressed, right? And how does that happen? So I'm not opposed to data collection, but the thing is all data could become carceral, meaning it could be used for carceral purposes. So the challenge politically is like, how do we recognize that harm and violence has happened when it does? What are the mechanisms for people to kind of get help for that beyond kind of the police? And that's going to involve sometimes some data stuff where we're thinking about policy, or we're thinking about programs that can help people. Do you know what I mean? Right?
So even in our collection of data, we can be reinforcing an abolitionist imagination, right? We can be referring to these things as harm. We can be talking about things like...
Thank you for using Securus. Goodbye.
We'll see if he can call back one more time. I don't know if it's 3 or 4 that's our limit for a call period. And if you can't call back, I'll just ask you to say some like closing thoughts that we can use. But yeah, thank you for all this. This is like such an interesting one of the most interesting interviews that we've done so far, and like especially for something that's like I when I was doing research on this, I was like, man, this is like a lot of numbers, and I'm a very humanities person, and this is way out of my depth, and you still can make it so interesting. But yeah, he's calling back now. 1 second.
Oh, awesome. Okay.
Hello, this is a free call from
An incarcerated individual at SCI Fayette. This call is not private. It will be recorded and may be monitored. If you believe this should be a private call, please hang up and follow facility instructions to register this number as a private number.
To accept this free call, press 1. To refuse this free call, press 2. If you would like to thank you for using Securus. You may start the conversation now.
Hey. I'm gonna switch you over. All right.
So, yeah, just, can we, even in this collection of crime data, right? I'm saying crime data now. In this new imagining of collecting data around harm and how people are harmed, and even asking them, maybe how they respond to that harm, right? Like, did they do transformative or restorative justice approaches? And so even in our surveying and interviewing, we can present a different construction of how people look at these things. That's just something that I was imagining. But I only have a couple minutes left. So I don't know if this is more personal or academic, but do you think that the increase in homicides right now in cities like Philadelphia are due to efforts to defund the police? Do you think that's a real thing?
No, I mean, I think what happens is, most homicides are actually between people who know each other or have shared geography, right? And people are often in networks or geographies with people of kind of the same social class background, and a lot of times the same shared struggles in various ways. And I think the pandemic, and I think, it's just, I'm not surprised that certain activity that is harmful might be on the rise. And the reason being is we are in a very, more scarier than usual and more desperate than usual time, right? And, and so I'm not surprised that harmful, whether self-harm or kind of harms to others behaviors might be on the, rise, even as I'm concerned about the way the crime data gets talked about to go against abolition. So I'm not interested in kind of reaffirming the crime data things. And that's why I think it's important to say, okay, how is harm different from that? Because some harm might be happening, self-harm or harm against others might be happening or increasing. But, what are other ways we can diagnose that? And what are other ways that we can treat that outside of the carceral system, right?
Right, definitely. Well, Ian, you got any follow-ups?
I think what you're talking about in terms of crime data, or not crime data, but data collection itself and the practice of data collection is really interesting in thinking about, I guess, what is, if anything, your vision of how data collection can be used in building a better world and building a world that has an abolitionist mode of organization.
So, Safear, what do you think?
What do I think? I like how you keep putting me on the spot. I think you should do it. I mean, I'm not an expert of crime data, obviously. I just, when I think of creating an abolitionist world, I always think of, like Ruth Wilson Gilmore will say, presence, not absence, right? So it's just about creating, these alternative structures.
This is a call from Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution, Fayette. This call is subject to recording and monitoring.
And systems where people can relate to each other in a more humane way. One of the, I'm a Muslim, so I'm a Muslim, I'm a present abolitionist. And the way I look at abolition is through the reduction of harm, right? I want to create a society that has the least amount of harm that we can possible, right? And in doing that, I want to create and imagine different ways that people can relate to each other. I want to, basically like this. Policing, as it exists now, has not been working, right? We see it hasn't been working. You got over 2.7 million people locked up, and that hasn't been working to reduce harm. I mean, it's clear that the measures that we've been using to reduce harm in this country have only been causing more harm. So anybody with some intellect will say, okay, well, we need to start imagining new ways. I also think that we don't have the answers yet completely. I think that it's through our struggle in, removing carceral systems that new answers will become clear, right? Like your theory will become more refined through practice. But I do think there has to be a certain level of humanism there, a certain level of relating to each other and building community on a human level. That's how I look at it.
Yeah, I like that.
Good. Glad you do. Thank you so much again for coming on and doing this. It means a lot, seriously. We're kind of...
This is a call from
Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution. Say it.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring.
A lot of times with podcasts and different media materials, the prisoner is constantly positioned as the subject, somebody to be analyzed and interviewed and almost objectified in certain ways. There's also a lot of gatekeeping issues for prisoners to have their perspectives actually told. So just to be able to have you come on here and you allow me to interview you, I think that that's abolitionist. I think that we're recreating and abolishing certain hierarchies, even in academia or, the professional world of how people look at prisoners. So I think that that's important, and I definitely appreciate it.
Wow, thank you so much. And I'm happy to kind of come back on the show as much as you want. I'm not trying to fish for another invitation, so I don't want to pressure you. But I would be happy to come back anytime you need me. So.
Awesome. I will take you up on that. There ain't no pressure on me. You put it on you. All right. Yes. All right. So again. Hopefully we can even, remain in somewhat contact or something and, take it from there. But I'm going to go for right now. If Ian has maybe a follow-up or something that you may want to do as an introduction for you that we can put at the beginning, maybe he can handle that. But I got to go right now. So,
okay. Right. Thank you so much.
All right. Later.
The caller has hung up.
But yeah, so is there anything that you're working on right now that you would want people to know about, or any resources that you want to direct people to while they're listening to this podcast?
Oh man, I'm not prepared.
I apologize.
I'm like, am I working on something? I should actually know this, but yeah, no, I'm not kind of prepared to answer that question.
Okay, no problem.
I hope you don't include that.
Yeah.